talk about acceptance. We're on to the final stage of grief. We've been moving through these stages throughout Lent. It's been definitely super interesting. A lot of different topics have been covered. And when I found out acceptance was going to be mine, it's kind of an interesting word. And I started out and I just kind of wrote down words or like phrases that I thought went along with acceptance. It has a lot of different connotations. And I was asking people, asked my roommate, and she said, love. She said that's what acceptance was. And my first thought is always peace and calm. When you keep digging into this, there's just a ton of options. Kind of a unity, a seal of approval, yes, adequate, suitable, resignation, concession, reluctant affirmation. The list is infinite, really. But they kind of seem to group into a couple main ideas. First, the idea of settling for something. That was the first one I think of. Sometimes people say acceptance, you're like, okay, this is what it's going to be. Then there's the idea of acknowledgement or affirmation. And that's kind of like resignation, but with a much more positive spin, I guess. And then finally, back to what my roommate was thinking, love. And I think this one is really powerful because it's the idea of complete and total acceptance of who someone is, that affirmation of who they are, and how that kind of can lead to love, that fully known but still fully loved as well. And I talked about love a lot last time, so we're not going to jump into that this time. We're going to step back a little bit and look at acknowledgement or affirmation. But it's kind of going to be in the context of love, because the idea of affirmation and acknowledgement with like a backdrop of that. Just kind of keep that in your mind. And the heart of that connotation to me is about control. Because when you are acknowledging something, when you are affirming something, you're saying, okay, I'm going to go with that, I will follow that, I'm going to take a step back and not try to be in the reins anymore. Specifically today, we're going to be talking a lot about acceptance of God's will. And that is inherently connected to control. Because it takes a lot to say, okay, I'm not in control. Because we all know we're not in control, but sometimes you think you are. You're like, I got this, but you don't. And that means a lot about what acceptance is. And I don't want to say that's acceptance like, okay, God's in control, got it. It's a joyful affirmation that this is the way it's going to be because this is the way that God wills it to be. And we are accepting that fully. And that true acceptance, that's all about affirmation. And again, it's joyful, it's enthusiastic, but it's not always easy. And one thing that Logan and I have really noticed as we've been preaching this whole entire semester has been our primary influence for hearing sermons is one of our other campus pastors, Wade. And he really likes to preach on difficult topics. Especially he's got, college students, we're all kind of trying to figure out what we're doing. And sometimes it seems like he just wants people to be mad because he's like, he'll just throw out one little sentence and it'll just wreck your whole world because it just tears down what you're thinking or your expectations. And I think he just finds great joy in that. But we've learned that we really follow that because we'll start planning sermons and then John will ask us questions and we're like, oh my God, I don't want to preach on that. I don't know how to talk about that. I don't have the answers. And that's kind of where this goes along. It's the idea of acceptance, right? We don't have the answers. We can't control that. So sometimes jumping into these incredibly difficult topics, Logan talked about why good things happen to bad people, bad things happen to good people, and vice versa, I guess. A little bit different there. We talked about, what sin is. We talked about so many different things. And I was jumping into this one, and John said, you know what? You should probably talk about what God's will is and free will, what that looks like. I said, I don't want to do that. I don't know how to talk about that. But don't worry, we're going to talk about it. And I don't have all the answers, but there's a lot of things out there, a lot of prayer, a lot of different thoughts from other people. And that's really what's been super cool about this, is to be able to dive into that. But today we're going to jump into free will and Jesus' human side. So that'll be super exciting. The scripture we're going to start with today is from Luke chapter 23. It's up on the screen, verses 39 to 45. It's right before Jesus is arrested. He came out and went, as was his custom, to the Mount of Olives, and the disciples followed him. When he reached the place, he said to them, "Pray that you may not come into the time of trial." Then he withdrew from them about a stone's throw, knelt down, and prayed, "Father, if you are willing, remove this cup from me. Yet not my will, but yours be done." Then an angel from heaven appeared to him and gave him strength. In his anguish he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat became like great drops of blood falling down on the ground. Now, this is an interesting passage, right? Because we've got Jesus, and he's praying in the garden, crying out in prayer. But Jesus is also God and human. And it's a really crazy dichotomy when you think about it. Jesus is crying out to God, but he's also God at the same time, the whole idea of Trinity. And he's saying, take this from me if you can, but not my will, but yours. And it's just wild to try and understand that, because he's God, he's struggling with God. He doesn't seem to know what's going to happen in this moment, but he also does know what's going to happen. And I think that's just something we really have to kind of struggle with, is just to know that this is a moment that you can see that Jesus is fully human and fully God, because he's showing both sides in this moment. And that's one of the big parts. But another huge part of that is that Jesus is showing his full human side here, and it is an incredible example of acceptance of God's will. And really what that process looks like. Because he's showing that it's not simple. Because he's not just like, all right, I guess this is going to happen. It's going to be rough. Instead, he's like, God, I don't want this. How do I not do this? Like, I'm scared almost. He doesn't say he's scared. I don't want to put those words into it. But you can imagine that if you were in a position like this, there would be fear involved in this. There would be a lot of just worrying. And again, here at the heart of it is control. He doesn't know what's coming next in this moment that he's praying. And he's providing a model for us to show that acceptance can be really difficult. And that is okay to acknowledge. But not only that, after he prays, after this moment of intense crying out to God, he goes back and joins the rest of the disciples, right? He just goes out. And they're sleeping, and that's a whole other mess, different sermon. But he goes out, and he carries on. And then shortly afterwards, there's the betrayal, and he's arrested. And in that moment, it's just kind of like, okay, this is what's happening. He's struggled, and now he's at peace. Because he knows this is what's going to be, and he's accepted. And not in a resigned manner, but in a at peace, calm. This is not my will, but yours. Be done here. And he really demonstrates that it's okay to not want to do difficult things. Sometimes it seems like you have to have it all together, or you have to, like, you can't struggle with God. You can't cry out and say, I don't want to do this. I don't know if this is the right path. But Jesus himself is showing us here that is okay. But it has to continue. It can't end with that struggle. It has to continue and move forward to an acceptance. It moves forward from pleading with God, from crying out, from anguish to acceptance of what God's will is. And moving on to that. And ceding control and saying, maybe I don't know what that will is. Because Jesus did know at this point. We don't know. We never know, right? But you can let go of that. And as a background after that struggle, saying, okay, I'm going to give up control because I know that your plan is better than my plan. And that's pretty wild. I think that is a really, really cool example. It's not very often that you get really powerful figures, Jesus saying, like, this is hard, and showing that model for you. And that's pretty awesome. And I think that it's really powerful because it also sometimes comes out that people are saying that, if you are struggling with this or if you don't know where God is, that that's a lack of faith. But instead, I want to argue that that is not a lack of faith. That shows even more faith because crying out says, I know God is in this. I may not see him, I may not feel him in this moment, but I know he's here. And I'm going to keep going because I don't know where to go. I don't know what to do, but I know God's in this moment. And that shows a faith that you know God is there, God is working, and you know that there is a plan, even if you don't know what that plan is. Now, there's an interesting dichotomy here, right? Because we've got the idea of accepting God's will. But we also have free will. But God's will will prevail in the end. And it starts to kind of get in a circle like that if you keep going. Like, it's very, very Christian. And again, I will not pretend to have this all figured out. I certainly don't. But there's some things that we're going to break it down into 3 different sections. It's going to make it a little bit clearer and perhaps make a little bit more sense. And this is kind of informed a little bit by a sermon that Wade, our pastor on campus, gave last year, and then also a book called The Will of God by Leslie Webhead, and also lots of other resources, research, and of course, the Bible. So Webhead breaks God's will, he's the writer of the Will of God, he breaks God's will into 3 parts. There's the idea of intentional will, circumstantial will, and ultimate will. And it's a little bit wild once you get into it, but hopefully this will make the idea of free will and God's will make a little more sense here as we go. So intentional will is God's best for us. That is the original plan. You can think like Adam and Eve in the garden. Everything was wonderful. There was no shame. There was no sin. There was nothing. It was just the people and God. And that's what it is. Or you can think about, God's path for you before other humans and you got involved in the system. That's the perfect situation. Then comes circumstantial will. And this is where it gets super messy. Because this is also known as permissive will. And this is what God allows to happen. So, God is omniscient, omnipotent, all-powerful, right? Nothing happens. When there's tragedy, when there's good things, you know that God could have stopped it or moved it forward. And the idea of circumstantial or permissive will is when accidents, when humans get in the way, when we exercise our free will, and God allows things to happen. One big example right now, if you think about the Ethiopian Airlines crash, right? I don't believe that we have a God who wanted those people to die, to suffer. I don't think that we read that anywhere that God wants innocent people to have an end like that, or their families, or the government, or the company. They don't. God doesn't want that, but He allowed it to happen, and He's going to be working through that situation. And you can also think the tornado that was in Lee County. A lot of lives were lost, a lot of property damage, and that county is going to be recovering for years. You can think back to the tornado here. Again, that is something that God allowed to happen. And that's the idea of that circumstantial will. And it isn't always. We don't know what's circumstantial will and what's not. But a lot of times when free will, when humans do things, that is something that God allows to happen and then works through that situation. Now, a lot of times you're asking in this moment, why? Why did God stop that? What are we moving towards? Why? And we don't always know the answer. Sometimes we think we know it, sometimes we have absolutely no clue. But we're always moving towards one final thing. And this is God's ultimate will. And this is the redemption of God's best for us. It's God's intentional will realize that despite our interference, despite human actions, despite free will, because God is going to prevail in the end. We cannot prevent that, but he does give us free will along the way. Now, one really hard thing, and that's a lot of things. If you have questions about it, you can ask John. But, or me, and I'll try my best, but I'll probably say, go talk to John. But that's just like, the overview. The important part thing here to come back to is what's the point, right? Because if God's ultimate will is going to prevail, if God's intentional will is ultimately probably going to change because of humans having free will. God gave us free will, and so things are going to change along the way, but then his ultimate will be realized. Like, does that matter? Do our actions matter? Why struggle, right? Yes, it does matter. Yes, we should keep struggling. I want to go to another story in Esther. So if you haven't read Esther, you should definitely do it. It's a fantastic story. It's in the Old Testament, and it's about this woman who she was in Persia, and she goes to the king, all the eligible women in the land to go through this process because he's trying to pick a new queen because he killed his other queen. It's a whole hot mess. It's one of those, great stories in the Bible because if you really think about it, it's just crazy what happens. But anyway, she goes through this whole process, and she ends up being the queen. And she doesn't say that she's Jewish, but she's Jewish. And at one point, one of the king's advisors has this plan to pretty much just kill all the Jews. And one of Esther's brothers comes to her and says, hey, we gotta fix this. You are the queen. Can you do something about this? And that is an interesting moment right there. Because there's the idea of God's will, right? And the Jewish people are God's chosen people. So the idea of one kingdom taking them all out seems contrary to his will. We don't know, of course. We don't have the answers. But what Mordecai, Esther's relative, says to her is that, again, we don't know the answers here. We don't know what's going to happen if you don't act, if you do act. But we do know that you are in a position. God has allowed you to get to this position. He's allowed you to become the queen. He's blessed you with this opportunity. And maybe you're here so you can save our people. Maybe this is a time where this power really matters. And at first, she's not so sure about it. Because if she goes and talks to the king without being summoned, she could be killed. So she's got a lot at stake here. So do the Jewish people. But she's got a lot at stake immediately for her. And this is a moment where, again, we see that example of how struggling with God and moving toward that acceptance can be. Because she tells Mordecai, go back to our people and tell them to pray and fast. And she tells her servants, asks her servants to pray and fast with her. She says she's going to pray and fast. And she's ready to take that time, and then she's going to go see the king. So she's preparing. This is a moment of struggle where in her mind she's like, I don't know. But at this point she's moving towards, yes, I'm going to go talk to the king, I'll risk it, because let's see if we can save these people. Yeah, God's will prevail, but maybe he put me here as an action so we can take care of this. And it works out. She saves the Jewish people. It's a great story. You really should go read it. Highly recommend it. And she really just kind of steps up there. And that's a moment where she says, I don't know what's going to happen. God, I don't know. And God isn't brought up in this story. But you know that she's a Jewish woman. She has that background of faith. But in that moment, there is this time where she doesn't know what the plan is. And she says, okay, this seems like what the plan. This seems like what has come to from this time of fasting. This seems like what needs to be done, and I'm going to move forward. And again, it's not resignation. It's more of at peace, calm, a letting go of control. Saying, okay, I'm going to go try to save the people. Let's do this. And that's pretty Again, very cool example. These examples in the Bible where we've got moments where people are really struggling are so powerful because they tell us that we don't have to know it right away. We don't have to know the answer. But they also show us that we can't just stop with that struggle and give up. We can't say, okay, I don't know what's next, I'm just going to give up. Or, I guess this is what it's going to be. But rather, this seems, through prayer, this seems like what God is leading me towards. Or, I know this is going to happen. And there's that acceptance that is in a more joyful manner, sometimes even an enthusiastic manner, because you've given up that control. You said, okay, God, take it away from me. I don't have control. I cannot control it. I'm going to stop pretending. I'm going to hand it to you, and I'm going to move forward. And that's where we're going to go. Paul speaks to this as well in Romans. In Romans 8:17, he says, now, if we are children, then we are heirs, heirs of God and co-heirs with Christ. If indeed we share in sufferings, in order that we may also share in his glory. There's that idea here again, that we are heirs of God, co-heirs of Christ. We are God's children. He's going to look after us. But it doesn't mean that it's going to be rosy along the way. It doesn't mean that God's will is always going to be, whether it is his intentional will or his circumstantial will. God's best for us or what God has allowed to happen. It doesn't mean that it's going to be pleasant along the way, but it does mean that we can share his glory in that joyful acceptance. Now, there's a lot of tension involved in this whole idea. And I think that with that, there's kind of the idea, this whole season of Lent, we've had this sermon series that is on, it's a process, right? We're talking about the stages of grief. And this idea of acceptance, of understanding God's will, of moving towards God's will, of giving up control to God, is a process sometimes. Sometimes we are stubborn. Sometimes we don't want to follow where we're going. Sometimes we can see, or we think we can see, or we're pretty sure that this is what God's doing, and yet we say, no, I'm not going to do that. But that's not how it needs to end. Instead, it's time to turn back around and say, okay, God, here, I'm ready. And yet none of these people were resigned to it. They said they were at peace. They were calm. It's a very different kind of affirmation, different kind of acceptance than resignation. Very different emotions surrounding when they've given up this control, when they've accepted. And what does that mean for us, right? How do we take the story of Esther? How do we take Jesus struggling in the garden? How do we take that to today? Because again, we've got this idea that things are going to happen. God is going to allow things to happen. Different things are going to occur. God's intentional will, God's best for us, will not always be happening because we have this gift of free will. Not only that, because we have this gift of free will, sometimes we ourselves are going to try and struggle and turn away from what God's will is, from what his best is for us. And in these moments, that's when it's time to look back to these stories and see what they did. That's when it's time to sit down in prayer. And maybe that's the time to say, God, I don't know what you're doing. Help me. That's the moment to say, what are you doing, God? Because that is an acknowledgement that he's doing something. That is acknowledgement that he is there. Even if you don't see it, if you don't feel it, that's that moment to struggle through it. But it's also that moment to make a conscious effort to say, I know that I cannot do this. I know that I am not in charge. And so I'm going to pass it off. I'm going to let go of this facade where I think I'm in charge. And instead, I'm going to move towards, accept, affirm what God is doing, and move forward with that. Now, again, I want to come back to Jesus' struggle, right? He ends and he's crying out, and it is as if there is tears are on blood, right? It's a very intense moment, very graphic kind of image of struggle and prayer. But he has such a powerful end to that. He says, God, I believe, essentially. He doesn't say that word for word, but I believe, I will follow your will, not mine. He says in that moment that, I don't want this, but I know that your best is the best. Your best for me is the best. It's going to be the best plan. And then he doesn't step away from that moment and go back to the disciples and go back and to be arrested in a moment of anxiety. He doesn't go in depression. He doesn't go in denial of what's occurring. He goes in peace. He goes in calm. He is accepted what's going to occur. I want to end today with Psalm 139. I'm going to listen to these words and think about where you are trying to control it all. Think about some situation in your life that perhaps you're trying to hold on to with both hands, and you know that you're going to fail. Think about moments like those, and think about where you need to say, God, where are you? What are you doing? And then to say, maybe I don't know, but okay, God, this is yours. It's always been yours. I'm going to step back because I know that your plan is the best one. Oh Lord, you have searched me and know me. You know when I sit down and when I rise up. You discern my thoughts from far away. You search out my path and my lying down, and are acquainted with all my ways. Even before a word is on my tongue, O Lord, you know it completely. You hem me in, behind and before, and lay your hand upon me. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me. It is so high that I cannot obtain it. Where can I go from your spirit? Or where can I flee from your presence? If I ascend to heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in Sheol, you are there. If I take the wings of the morning and settle at the farthest limits of the sea, even there your hand shall lead me, and your right hand shall hold me fast. If I say, surely the darkness shall cover me, and the light around me become night, even the darkness is not dark to you. The night is as bright as the day, for darkness is as light to you. Bow your heads with me. Dear Lord, thank you that we can be with you this morning. Please help us to know that your will is the best way. Lord, help us to know when we're stuck, when we're struggling, that you want to hear that. Help us to follow your Son's example and know that it's okay to admit that we're stuck and we're not sure. But Lord, help us to know that in the end, it's time to accept you. In the end, we can give up control and give it to you because you've had us all along. You go behind us and before us. Be with us as we have this week. When we remember this and think about this message,